conditioning. The only way I know to really explain this is through an analogy. Suppose I'm a travel agent, and you come to me to plan a vacation. And I say to you, I've got just the place for you. It's this island. It's somewhere in the Pacific. Most people who go there have a really good time. The food's good, the beaches are nice, lots of sunshine. But a few people from time to time get food poisoning and die. A couple have been eaten by sharks. Sometimes there's a typhoon. But sometimes everything's really nice. Do you want to go? And you'd probably look at me like I was nuts. Who would want to go to some place where you're at the mercy of the weather, of other people's cooking, at fish in the sea, and you never know exactly what's going to happen to you? What a terrible place that would be. You would have no control over your life. The Buddha's insight is that's the ticket you bought when you were born. You live in a world where most of what happens to you is completely out of your control. You don't control the stock market. You don't control what's going on in Europe. You don't control what the weather is. You don't control what illnesses might befall you or illnesses might befall your friends. You live in a world of uncertainty, and the uncertainty is because everything depends upon a vast network of causes and conditions that are out of your control. And that background anxiety that causes is the pervasive suffering that is what gives rise to the suffering of change, because change occurs as a result of causes and conditions, and what conditions the suffering of suffering. That deep analysis of the nature of suffering is what makes the Buddha's insight that all this is suffering more than just a banality. Buddhist ethics is about solving a problem. Diagnosis is the first part of the problem. The diagnosis continues with the second truth. The second truth is that there's a cause of suffering. Bumper stickers to the contrary notwithstanding, suffering doesn't just happen. It, like everything else, happens for a reason. And the Buddha's insight was that suffering is caused by attraction and aversion. It's caused by wanting something but not being able to get it, or getting something and not wanting it. Those are the two principal causes of suffering. I want it but can't have it. I've got it, and gosh, I wish somebody else had it. Those are the first two causes. But those two causes in turn are caused by something else. And this is part of the deep insight of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. What is that something else? That something else is what the Buddha called primal ignorance, or basic confusion. And that confusion is not recognizing that things are impermanent, not recognizing that things are selfless, not recognizing that things are interdependent. Because the Buddha recognized that most of us in most of our lives treat ourselves and those things around us as though they are enduring, relatively stable, permanent things. We treat them as though they have natures that make them the things that they are, independent of our imputation and desires, independent of their parts, independent of their causes and conditions. That I am a self-made man with plans for the future. I am an independent entity. You can't tell me what to do or make me do what I don't want to do. And we fail to understand interdependence. That confusion that the Buddha is talking about, that ignorance, isn't a mere lack of understanding. It's a positive phenomena. It's a reflex cognitive habit, a superimposition of permanence, entityhood, and independence on that which is impermanent, selfless, and interdependent. By superimposing those, we treat what is attractive as a lot more important than it is. We treat what's aversive as a lot worse than it is. And we treat them as having natures that make them desirable or undesirable as they are in themselves. And we treat change as something to be dreaded, something to hate, something to be resisted, rather than a natural part of our lives. And so that superimposition is what causes attraction and aversion. And the attraction and the aversion give rise to the sufferings of pervasive conditioning, change, and the suffering of suffering. That's the diagnosis of the cause of suffering. Well, it's one thing to say that suffering has a cause, but what do you do about that? The great thing to know, the Buddha said, about the cause of suffering is that once you know that it has a cause, you know that there is a release from suffering. You know that because to release yourself from something that's caused, all you got to do is remove the cause. So if you're sick because there's bacteria in you, get rid of the bacteria, you get rid of the illness. So the Buddha's insight was that because the fundamental root cause of suffering is this kind of primal ignorance or instinctive confusion, if we eliminate that, suffering can cease. And so, the idea in Buddhist practice is to reduce attraction, to reduce aversion, and to do that by reducing this primal confusion, that is, by coming to understand the fundamental nature of reality. Notice here we have to distinguish between pain and suffering. It's one thing for me to have a headache. It's another thing for that headache to be a source of my suffering. It's one thing for me not to have a Mercedes-Benz. It's another thing for my lack of Mercedes-Benz-hood to be a source of suffering. The Buddha said we can't get rid of pain. We can't get rid of change. We can't get rid of old age, illness, and death. But we can get rid of the suffering that they attend. And we achieve that by removing this kind of primal confusion about those things and about ourselves. So here we're operating with a kind of medical model, and the Buddha is often called the great physician. We have a diagnosis, there's suffering, and it has these three forms. We have an etiology, that is primal confusion leading to attraction and ignorance. We have a cure, now that we know it is possible, that is the removal of that confusion with the consequent removal of the attraction and aversion. But now we need a prescription. And the prescription is the fourth truth, the so-called Eightfold Path for those who would be noble. The Eightfold Path sets out the domain of morality for Buddhism. And it sets it out not by a set of commandments, not by identifying a set of virtues, not even by identifying a set of goods, but by pointing out a set of domains. In Sanskrit, we'd call them vastus, domains of concern, suggesting that if we pay attention to those domains and live appropriately in those domains, we can eliminate primal ignorance, eliminate attraction, eliminate aversion, and hence eliminate suffering. So morality here is a kind of identification of domains of life in which we need to solve problems. There are three principal domains in this story. The first is the domain of action. The limbs of the Eightfold Path there are right action. Do things that conduce to happiness and not to suffering, to oneself and for others. Right livelihood. How we make our living makes a difference. If you make your living as a hitman, then elimination of suffering is pretty hard. If you make your living doing something that's charitable and beneficial, that organizes your life in fundamental ways that will make your life happier. There's a Buddhist insight here that the way we make our livings organizes our lives in fundamental ways. Right propriety. Carry yourself right. Be honest, be decent, behave in a polite way and a pleasant way with people, because that makes you more effective. And you can only work to eliminate suffering, that of yourself or others, if you're effective. And if you don't maintain propriety, nobody's going to listen to you. Right speech. Tell the truth. Don't tell lies. Say what's useful. Don't talk about what's useless. That's the domain of action. There's also a domain of thought. In the domain of thought, the Buddha distinguished right view. You really do need to understand interdependence, impermanence, and selflessness if you want to eliminate suffering. Right meditation. That is, it's not enough to think about this theoretically, because what we're trying to uproot is an instinctive way of seeing reality, not just a theory about it. And that requires the view to settle in, to become part of how we take up with the world. And the reason that meditation is so important in Buddhism is that that's the vehicle for allowing the view to settle in and to become part of how we behave instinctively and naturally. Right effort. The Buddha emphasized that none of this is easy. You've really got to work at it. You've really got to pay attention. You've really got to do it. And finally, right mindfulness. Because it's actually easy, as a teacher of mine once said, to practice the first 7 of these at any moment. Do it right now. Maintain the right view. Meditate for a second. Make some effort right now. Don't do anything bad, and so forth. And as he pointed out, all you need to do is to do that for 1 second, then another second, then another second, then another second, and you can follow those 7 parts of the Eightfold Path for your entire life. But how do you make sure that you're doing it from moment to moment? That's where mindfulness comes in, paying attention to what you're doing moment to moment. And this notion of mindfulness is an absolute foundation of all of Buddhist practice. That's one of the deep insights that we're going to take away from this, that the fundamental idea, the fundamental practice in making one's life meaningful is to be mindful of it moment to moment. All of this forces us to focus on the impermanence of things, to focus on the fact that things are interdependent, to focus on the fact that any identity things have is our projection. And that reduces our attachment to things. We know they just come and go. It reduces our aversion to things. We know that they just come and go. And so it reduces our suffering. In the next few lectures, we're going to examine the way that these fundamental ideas of Buddhism develop, and develop into an account of precisely how we should lead our lives and how our lives can become meaningful in the context of the moral theory of the great Buddhist scholar Shantideva in his wonderful text, How to Lead an Awakened Life.